The neighborhood of Maple Grove had always been a peaceful place. The streets were clean, the lawns were green, and people smiled at each other when they walked their dogs in the evening. But everything changed when the Han family moved into the big blue house at number 47 Oak Street. Ta Han was 18 years old, and his sister Jai Han was 17. They looked like normal teenagers on the outside. Tai was tall and liked to wear black clothes. Ji was shorter and always carried her phone in her hand. Their parents were hardly ever home because they worked at big companies in the city. Mr. Han was a banker, and Mrs. Han was a lawyer. They thought giving their children lots of money and freedom would make them happy. They were wrong. On this particular Monday morning, the sun was just starting to rise over Maple Grove. The street lights were turning off one by one. Most people were still sleeping, but Mr. David Johnson was already awake. He was 75 years old and had lived in his small white house at the end of Cedar Street for 42 years. Every morning, he would wake up at 5 o'clock to tend to his garden. "Martha, honey," he called to his wife. "I'm going out to check on the roses." Mrs. Martha Johnson was in the kitchen making coffee. She was 73 and still moved around the kitchen like a dancer, even with her bad knee. "Don't forget your hat, David," she reminded him. "The sun's getting stronger these days." Mr. Johnson stepped out onto his front porch and frowned. Someone had thrown empty soda cans onto his lawn again. This was the third time this week. He knew who was doing it, but he hadn't said anything yet. He was a patient man who had seen much worse things in his life than teenagers throwing trash. As he bent down to pick up the cans, he heard laughing from across the street. Tai and Jai Han were walking to school early, which was strange because they usually left late. They weren't alone. With them were the Kim twins, Du and Sun, who lived 2 streets over. The 4 teenagers were looking at something on Ji's phone and laughing. Mr. Johnson watched them carefully. In his 42 years living in Maple Grove, he had seen many families come and go. He had seen good kids and troubled kids. These 4 reminded him of troubled kids he used to help when he was a high school teacher before he retired 15 years ago. The teenagers noticed him looking. Ta Han whispered something to the others, and they laughed again, louder this time. Then they walked away, but not before Du Kim threw another empty can onto Mr. Johnson's lawn. Inside the house, Mrs. Johnson was watching through the window. She sighed and walked out to help her husband pick up the trash. "Those kids need help, David," she said softly. "They're lost, just like the Thompson boys were back in '85. Mr. Johnson nodded. The Thompson boys had been troublemakers too, but they had changed after Mr. Johnson spent a summer tutoring them in math. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow," he said. "But these kids, there's something different about them. They're angry about something." What the Johnsons didn't know was that at that very moment, the 4 teenagers were planning something much worse than throwing trash. They had stopped at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, and Ta Han was showing them something on his phone. "Look what I found in my dad's garage," he said with a mean smile. "Spray paint, 10 cans of it." Jai Han's eyes lit up. "Perfect," she said. "That old couple won't know what hit them." Du and Sun Kim looked at each other. The twins were usually quiet, but they had changed since becoming friends with the Hans. "When do we do it?" Sun asked. "Tonight," Tai answered. "The old people always go to their grandkids' house on Monday evenings. They stay for dinner and don't come back until late." What the teenagers didn't know was that they were being watched too. Not by people, but by something else. Something hidden in plain sight near the Johnsons' front porch. The day went on as normal. The teenagers went to school, where they sat at the back of their classes and ignored their teachers. Mr. Johnson worked in his garden, planting new flowers and talking to them like they were old friends. Mrs. Johnson baked cookies and took some to Mrs. Lee next door, who was recovering from a hip surgery. Around 4 o'clock, the Johnsons' grandson Tommy called. He was 28 years old and worked as an engineer at a company called the Quantum Defense Initiative. Nobody in Maple Grove knew exactly what he did, but they knew it was something to do with new technology. "Grandpa," Tommy said on the phone, "how's that security system I installed working?" Mr. Johnson looked at the small silver box near his front door. It was about the size of a playing card and had a tiny green light that blinked every few seconds. "It's working fine, son," he said, "though I still don't understand why you insisted on putting it in. We've never had any real trouble here." Tommy's voice got serious. "Better safe than sorry, Grandpa. That's not a regular security camera, you know. It's something special I developed at work. It won't just record if someone does something bad. It'll teach them a lesson they'll never forget." Mr. Johnson laughed. His grandson always said mysterious things about his work. "Well, we're heading to Jimmy and Sarah's house for dinner soon. They're making your mom's famous meatloaf recipe." "Have fun, Grandpa," Tommy said. "And don't worry about the house. Trust me, it's in good hands." At 6 o'clock, the Johnsons got into their old blue Chevrolet and drove away. As their car turned the corner, 4 shadows moved across the street. Ty, G, Do, and Son had been waiting behind the big oak tree in front of the Lee house. "Coast is clear," Ty said, pulling his backpack off his shoulders. He unzipped it and took out the cans of spray paint. They were different colors: red, black, and blue. He handed them out to the others. "I still don't get why we're doing this," Sun Kim said quietly. She was holding her can of paint like it might bite her. "Because it's funny," Jaihan said. "And because those old people think they're better than everyone else, always acting so nice and perfect. And because they don't belong here," Ty added with a mean look in his eyes. "My dad says this neighborhood used to be different before people like them moved in." Do Kim nodded, but he looked nervous too. "What if we get caught?" Ty laughed. "By who? There aren't any security cameras. I checked. And all the neighbors are either at work or having dinner. It's perfect timing." The small silver box by the front door blinked its green light a little faster as the teenagers walked up the Johnsons' driveway. None of them noticed it. They were too busy planning what they would write and draw on the walls of the little white house. "Wait," Jiz said, pulling out her phone. "We should record this. I want to post it online later." Her brother grinned. "Good idea. Show everyone what happens when people don't know their place." The sun was setting now, painting the sky orange and purple. In other parts of Maple Grove, families were sitting down to dinner. Children were finishing their homework. Parents were coming home from work. And 4 teenagers were about to learn that sometimes the worst punishment isn't getting caught by the police or getting grounded by your parents. Sometimes the worst punishment is being forced to understand exactly how wrong you are. The small silver box kept blinking as Ty shook his can of spray paint. The sound of the little ball rattling inside seemed very loud in the quiet evening air. G held up her phone, ready to record. Do and Son stood behind them, still looking unsure but not brave enough to walk away. None of them noticed that the silver box's green light had stopped blinking. Now it was glowing steady and bright, like a tiny star. And none of them knew that in just a few minutes their lives would change forever. Not because they would get caught, not because they would get in trouble, but because sometimes the universe, or in this case, a very clever grandson who worked with quantum technology, has ways of teaching lessons that no parent or teacher ever could. The first line of spray paint had barely touched the white wall when everything changed. The spray paint made a soft hissing sound as Tahan pressed down on the nozzle. The red paint looked like blood against the clean white wall of the Johnsons' house. Behind him, Jay was recording everything on her phone, trying not to laugh too loudly. Do and Sun Kim stood nearby, holding their own spray cans but not moving yet. "Come on, guys," Ta said, stepping back to look at what he had started to write. "Don't just stand there. Help me make this place look the way it should." The evening was getting darker now. The streetlights had come on, casting long shadows across the front yard. The small silver box by the door was glowing brighter than before, but none of the teenagers noticed. They were too busy with their cruel plan. Jay stopped recording for a moment and grabbed a blue spray can. "I know what to write," she said, moving to another part of the wall. Her brother grinned as she started spraying hateful words, words that would have made their parents ashamed if they knew what their children were really like. Do Kim finally stepped forward, his hand shaking as he held his can of black paint. "Maybe we shouldn't," he started to say, but Ta cut him off. "Don't be such a baby," Ta sneered. "They deserve this. Did you see how that old man looked at us this morning? Like he was better than us." Sun Kim was the last to join in. She walked up to the wall slowly, like she was being pulled by an invisible string she couldn't break. "I don't think Mr. Johnson was looking down on us," she said quietly. "He was just sad about the trash." "Shut up and paint," Ji told her. "Or are you scared?" That was when it happened. The silver box by the door suddenly made a high-pitched sound, like a whistle but softer. All four teenagers turned to look at it, seeing it for the first time. The green light had turned bright blue, and it was pulsing like a heartbeat. "What is that thing?" Du asked, taking a step back. Before anyone could answer, the blue light exploded outward, but it wasn't like regular light. It was like a wave of water in the air, spreading out in all directions. When it touched the teenagers, they felt strange, like they were falling asleep while standing up. "What's happening?" Ji tried to say, but her voice sounded far away. Her phone slipped from her hand and fell to the grass, still recording. The world around them started to change. The night disappeared, replaced by bright sunlight. The house in front of them was the same, but it looked newer, fresher. The paint was bright white, like it had just been done. The garden was different too, with younger plants and no rose bushes. A car pulled up to the house, an old-style car that looked like it was from many years ago. The teenagers couldn't move. They could only watch as a much younger Mr. and Mrs. Johnson got out of the car. They looked so different, but it was definitely them. They were both smiling big smiles, and Mrs. Johnson was holding a set of keys. "Our first house, Martha," the young Mr. Johnson said, putting his arm around his wife. "Can you believe it?" But then another car drove by slowly, and angry voices called out terrible words, the same kinds of words the teenagers had just been spray painting on the walls. The young couple's smiles faded, but they stood straight and proud. "Don't worry, dear," young Mrs. Johnson said. "They'll learn to accept us eventually. We'll show them what good neighbors we can be." The scene changed again. Now the teenagers were inside the house, but they still couldn't move or speak. They watched as years passed like minutes. They saw the Johnsons facing angry neighbors who didn't want them there. They saw Mr. Johnson helping those same neighbors fix their cars later, and Mrs. Johnson bringing food when someone was sick. They saw the Johnsons working hard every day. Mr. Johnson teaching at the local high school, staying late to help struggling students. Mrs. Johnson volunteering at the community center, teaching people to read. They saw them saving every penny to keep their house beautiful, even when times were hard. The teenagers felt everything the Johnsons felt. Every unkind word hurt like it was being said to them. Every dirty look stung like a slap. But they also felt the Johnsons' strength, their determination to respond to hate with love, their deep belief that people could change and learn to be better. They saw Christmas mornings when the Johnsons invited lonely neighbors for dinner. They saw summer afternoons when neighborhood kids, white and black, played in their yard while Mrs. Johnson made lemonade for everyone. They saw Mr. Johnson helping the Thompson boys with math, even though those boys had once broken their windows with rocks. The scenes moved faster now. Decades passed like the pages of a book being flipped. The teenagers saw the neighborhood changing. They saw new families moving in, families of all different backgrounds. They saw how the Johnsons welcomed each one, helping them feel at home, just like they had wished someone had done for them years ago. They saw the day Tommy, the Johnsons' grandson, graduated from college. They felt the pride and joy in Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's hearts. They saw Tommy visiting often, bringing strange devices and talking about his work with quantum physics. They saw him installing the silver box by the door, explaining to his grandparents that it was more than just a security system. "It's programmed with your memories," Tommy had said. "If anyone ever tries to hurt you or damage your home, it will show them the truth. It will make them understand." The teenagers were crying now, tears running down their faces as they stood frozen in time. They couldn't move their hands to wipe the tears away. They had to feel everything, see everything, understand everything. They saw themselves through the Johnsons' eyes. They saw how Mr. Johnson noticed them throwing trash in his yard, but chose to pick it up without complaint, remembering other angry young people who had eventually learned better ways. They saw how Mrs. Johnson prayed for them every night, asking God to help them find their way, just like the Thompson boys had. They saw the love that had built this house, the forgiveness that had painted these walls, the kindness that had planted this garden. They saw 42 years of turning hate into hope, 42 years of proving that love was stronger than fear. Finally, the blue light began to fade. The teenagers found they could move again. They stood in the dark, their spray cans lying forgotten on the ground. G's phone was still recording, but now it had captured something very different from what she had planned. Ta-Han looked at the red paint on the wall, the first letter of a hateful word he had started to write. It looked ugly now, like a scar on something beautiful. His hands were shaking as he reached for the cloth in his back pocket, the one he had brought to wipe paint off his hands. Instead, he started trying to clean the wall. Jay picked up her phone, but she couldn't look at it. She couldn't look at anything except the front door, remembering how many times it had opened to welcome people in need of kindness. Du and Sun Kim were holding hands like they used to when they were little kids, both of them crying quietly. The silver box's light had returned to its gentle green blink, but none of them would ever forget its blue glow. None of them would ever forget what it had shown them, what it had made them feel. "We need to fix this," Ta said, his voice rough with tears. "We need to make it right." "How?" G asked. "How do we fix being so wrong?" Sun wiped her eyes and looked at the cans of paint on the ground. "We start by cleaning up our mess," she said. "And then we learn to be more like them." Du nodded. "We saw 42 years of their lives in what felt like minutes," he said. "They never gave up on making things better. They never stopped believing people could change." The teenagers looked at each other, understanding in their tears what the Johnsons had understood all those years ago. That hate was a heavy thing to carry, but love made everything lighter. That forgiveness wasn't just a gift you gave others. It was a way to free yourself. The night was quiet around them as they began to clean, working together to erase the marks of hate they had tried to leave. They worked until their arms were tired, until every trace of their cruel intentions was gone. And as they worked, they made plans, plans to be different, plans to be better, plans to prove that the Johnsons' faith in people's ability to change was not misplaced. They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of their own 42-year story. A story that would start with this night, with this lesson, with this understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of love come from those who have every right to hate, but choose a better way. The four teenagers sat on the Johnsons' front steps, too tired to move after cleaning the wall. Their clothes were stained with paint and sweat, but the wall behind them was clean again. The night was quiet except for the soft chirping of crickets and the gentle ticking of Mrs. Johnson's wind chimes. Ta-Han looked at his hands. They were red and sore from scrubbing the wall, but that wasn't why he kept staring at them. He was remembering how it felt to be Mr. Johnson, 60 years ago, those same hands shaking as he opened hate mail in his mailbox, but still finding the strength to wave hello to unfriendly neighbors. "I can still feel it," G said softly, hugging herself even though the night wasn't cold. "I can feel how Mrs. Johnson's heart hurt when people pulled their children away from her at the grocery store. But she just kept smiling and being kind." Tears started falling from her eyes again. How could she be so strong? Sun Kim was holding her brother Du's hand, just like they had seen young Mr. and Mrs. Johnson hold hands for strength during hard times. Did you feel how happy they were? She asked. Even when people were mean to them, they had so much joy in their hearts. Remember that Christmas when they invited the Miller family for dinner? The ones who had put trash in their yard all summer. Du nodded, his voice full of wonder. And Mrs. Johnson made them her special sweet potato pie and wouldn't let them apologize. She just said, "Christmas is for new beginnings." The silver box on the wall blinked its gentle green light like it was listening to them talk. The device had shown them more than just memories. It had made them live through 42 years of experiences in what felt like minutes. They had felt every emotion, understood every thought, seen the world through the Johnsons' eyes. Ta stood up suddenly, walking to the garden. He stopped at the rose bushes Mr. Johnson talked to every morning. "We saw everything," he said, touching one of the roses gently. "We saw him planting these roses. Each one was for a different person who had learned to be better. The Thompson boys, the Miller family, the Rodriguez kids. The white roses are for people who change," Jai added, remembering the knowledge that had flowed into her mind during their experience. "The red ones are for people who became their friends. And the yellow ones," she stopped, her voice catching. "The yellow ones are for people they're still hoping will change." Son finished. "They planted those for us. Last week, after we threw the soda cans." The teenagers fell quiet, thinking about the yellow roses. They were thinking about how Mr. Johnson had looked at them that morning, not with anger or hate, but with hope. They understood now that he hadn't been looking down on them. He had been looking forward to the day these yellow roses might turn red. Du walked over to the garden hose and started watering the roses. The others watched him, understanding what he was doing. He was taking care of hope, helping it grow. "I keep remembering different things," G said, pulling out her phone. She had checked it earlier. Somehow, the device had changed what it recorded. Instead of showing their attempt to vandalize the house, it showed scenes from the Johnsons' lives, like memories captured on video. "Look at this." She played a clip that showed Mrs. Johnson teaching a young woman to read at the community center. The woman was crying because she had just read her first full sentence by herself, and Mrs. Johnson was hugging her, both of them so happy they were laughing and crying at the same time. "That woman became a teacher," Ta said, the knowledge appearing in his mind like he had always known it. "She teaches at the elementary school now. Her students love her because she's patient with kids who struggle, just like Mrs. Johnson was patient with her." Son walked over to the mailbox and opened it. Inside was a stack of letters, not hate mail like in the old days, but cards and letters from people whose lives the Johnsons had touched. She pulled out one letter and read it aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, you may not remember me, but 20 years ago, I was a scared teenager who had just moved to this neighborhood. My family didn't speak much English, and I was failing all my classes. Mr. Johnson tutored me every afternoon for a whole year, and Mrs. Johnson taught my mother to speak English. Today, I'm a doctor at the Children's Hospital. Every time I help a child, I remember your kindness. Thank you for believing in me." The letter was signed by Dr. Maria Garcia. There was a photo with it, showing her in her white doctor's coat, smiling in front of the hospital. "There are hundreds of letters like this," Du said, knowledge flowing into his mind. "People write to them all the time, telling them how their kindness changed lives. Not just their own lives, but their children's lives, their families' lives. It's like dropping a stone in water. The ripples keep spreading." Jai was scrolling through the videos on her phone, watching more memories. "Look at this one," she said. The video showed Mr. Johnson in his classroom 30 years ago, staying late to help a student understand algebra. The student was crying because he thought he was too stupid to learn math. But Mr. Johnson just smiled and said, "Nobody's stupid, son. Some people just need a different way to understand things. Let's try again." "That boy became an engineer," Ta said, the knowledge coming to him clearly. "He works with Tommy now, at the Quantum Defense Initiative. He helped design the device that just taught us all this." The teenagers looked at the silver box with new understanding. It wasn't just a security device. It was a teacher, just like Mr. Johnson had been. It taught the way he did, with patience and love, helping people understand things in a way that changed them forever. Sun walked to the front door and touched it gently. "I can feel a happiness in this house," she said. "All the people who found shelter here, all the meals shared at their table, all the tears dried and hearts healed. This house isn't just a building. It's 42 years of love made real. And we were going to hurt it," Du said, his voice breaking. "We were going to hurt them. How do we live with knowing what we almost did?" Tai looked at the yellow roses again. "We live with it by becoming better," he said, "like all the others who have their own roses in this garden. We learn." The next morning came with a bright sun and clear skies. Ta Han woke up early, which was unusual for him. He had barely slept, his mind full of memories that weren't his own but felt as real as if he had lived them himself. He got dressed quickly and looked out his window at the big blue house where he lived with his family. For the first time, he really saw it. The paint was expensive, the lawn was perfect, and the cars in the driveway were new and shiny. But there was no garden, no wind chimes, no signs of love or care. It was just a house, not a home like the... Mrs. Martinez looked shocked. She had never heard Ji's voice in class before, except when she was causing trouble. But Jai answered the question perfectly, and even smiled afterward. During lunch, they didn't sit alone like they usually did. Instead, they saw a new student eating by himself. They remembered how the Johnsons had always welcomed new neighbors, so they went to sit with him. "Hi," Sun said to the boy. "You're new here, right? Would you like to sit with us?" The boy looked scared at first. He had heard about these 4 students and their bad reputation, but something was different about them today. They were smiling real smiles, not mean ones. "I'm Kevin," the boy said quietly. "I just moved here from another state." "We know how hard it is to be new," Du said, remembering how it felt when the Johnsons had first moved to Maple Grove. "Would you like us to show you around?" After school, they walked to the community center together. The building was old but well cared for. They could feel the memories of this place now. All the lives that had been changed inside these walls, all the help that had been given, all the hope that had grown here. The woman at the front desk looked worried when she saw them come in. These teenagers had caused trouble here before, but Tai stepped forward with a polite smile, just like he had seen Mr. Johnson do in his memories. "We'd like to volunteer," he said. "Whatever you need help with. We want to learn how to be useful." The woman, whose name tag said Miss Thompson, looked surprised. Then she smiled. "Actually, we do need help. The after-school program needs tutors for elementary school kids who are struggling with reading and math." The 4 teenagers looked at each other. They remembered how Mr. Johnson had spent his life teaching, how Mrs. Johnson had taught people to read. It felt right that this would be their first step too. "We can do that," Ji said. "We're good at math and reading. We just haven't been using those skills the right way." Miss Thompson led them to a classroom where several young children were waiting for help with their homework. The kids looked nervous when they saw the teenagers, but Sun remembered how Mrs. Johnson always made scared people feel safe. She knelt down next to a little girl who was staring at her math homework with tears in her eyes. "Math can be tricky sometimes," Sun said gently, "but we can figure it out together. Want to try?" The little girl nodded, and Sun felt something warm in her heart. It was the same feeling she had felt in Mrs. Johnson's memories when she helped someone understand something new. For the next 2 hours, the 4 teenagers helped the children with their homework. They discovered that teaching wasn't easy. It took patience and kindness, and the ability to explain things in different ways until someone understood. But every time a child's face lit up with understanding, they felt that warm feeling again. "You know what this reminds me of?" Du said as they were leaving the community center. "Remember that memory we saw of Mr. Johnson helping the Thompson boys with math? How they went from being troublemakers to college graduates. Maybe that's what's happening to us too, Ta said. Maybe we're becoming one of their stories, one of their red roses. They walked toward Cedar Street together. They had decided to check on the Johnsons' house every day, to make sure no one else tried to hurt it. But when they got there, they saw Mr. Johnson in his garden, talking to his roses like always. The teenagers stopped, suddenly nervous. This was the first time they had seen him since their experience with the quantum device. What would they say? How could they explain? But Mr. Johnson just smiled when he saw them, like he had been expecting them. Maybe he had. Maybe the silver box had told him what happened, or maybe he just knew, the way he had always known when someone was ready to change. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice kind and welcoming. "The yellow roses could use some water, if you'd like to help." The teenagers walked into the garden, feeling both ashamed and hopeful. They had almost destroyed this place last night, but now they were being invited to help it grow. That was the lesson they had learned from 42 years of memories. That change was always possible, that it was never too late to start again, that the best way to make up for past mistakes was to help something beautiful grow. 1 year had passed since the night the quantum device had changed everything. The seasons had come and gone, bringing changes to the garden and to the teenagers who now spent so much time caring for it. The yellow roses Mr. Johnson had planted for them had turned red months ago. Now they bloomed bright and strong, their color a symbol of the friendship that had grown between the young people and the elderly couple they had once planned to hurt. On this particular Saturday morning, all 4 teenagers were in the Johnsons' garden. They came every weekend now, helping with the heavier work that Mr. Johnson couldn't do as easily anymore. Ty was fixing the garden fence, while Jeet was helping Mrs. Johnson plant new flowers. Dew and Sun were carefully trimming the rose bushes, making sure each one had room to grow. "Children," Mrs. Johnson called from the porch, where she was setting up a pitcher of lemonade. "Come take a break. I made cookies too." The teenagers smiled at being called children. A year ago, they would have been angry at being treated like kids, but now they understood it was Mrs. Johnson's way of showing love. They had learned so much about love in the past year. They sat on the porch steps, drinking lemonade and eating cookies, while Mr. Johnson told them stories about the neighborhood. But these weren't new stories anymore. They had lived them all in their memories that night. Still, they liked hearing him tell them, liked seeing the way his eyes lit up when he talked about people changing and growing. "Mr. Johnson," Ta said during a quiet moment, "remember the Thompson boys you helped with math? We saw them in your memories that night. We've been wondering, are we like them now?" The old man smiled, looking at the red roses that used to be yellow. "You're your own story," he said kindly. "The Thompson boys found their way, and you're finding yours. That's all anyone can ask for." Jay pulled out her phone, not to check social media, which she hardly used anymore, but to show them something. "Look what I found when I was going through the videos from that night again," she said. She played a clip that showed a scene from 30 years ago. Young Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sitting on these same porch steps, talking about their hopes for the future. "I believe this house has a purpose," young Mrs. Johnson was saying in the video. "It's not just our home. It's a place where people can learn to be better, learn to love more. Every brick, every flower, every wind chime is part of that purpose." The teenagers watched the video, feeling the truth of those words. In the past year, they had helped make that purpose grow even stronger. They had turned the community center's tutoring program into something special. Now, instead of just helping with homework, they taught art classes too, just like Mr. Johnson had done years ago. They used their own story to show other young people that change was possible. Their parents had noticed the change too. The Hans weren't always too busy for their children anymore. They had learned to listen, to pay attention. The Kims had watched their twins grow from angry teenagers into young adults who cared about making the world better. "You know what I think about sometimes," Sun said, helping herself to another cookie. "I think about other teenagers like us, in other places, kids who are angry and lost like we were. What if they had something like that quantum device to help them understand? That's exactly what Tommy's working on, Mrs. Johnson said with a proud smile. He's developing new versions of the device, not just for security, but for teaching empathy in schools and community centers. The teenagers looked at the small silver box by the door with new respect. Its green light blinked steadily, reminding them of how its blue light had changed their lives that night. But it's not just about the device, Du said thoughtfully. It's about having someone who believes in you, even when you're at your worst. Like you and Mrs. Johnson believed in us. Mr. Johnson nodded, looking at each of them with warm eyes. And now you believe in others. I've seen you at the community center, working with those children. You're patient with them, kind to them. You're doing for them what was done for you. Jai stood up and walked to the garden, looking at all the roses. Each one has a story, she said. The white ones for people starting to change, the yellow ones for people who might change, and the red ones for people who have become friends. She touched one of the red roses gently. Our roses. Ty joined his sister in the garden. But it's more than that now, he said. Look at all the new yellow roses you've planted recently. Each one is for someone we brought here, someone we think might need what we needed. It was true. In the past year, the teenagers had brought other troubled young people to the garden. Some came to help with the work, some came to talk with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and some just came to sit quietly and think. The garden was growing, not just with flowers, but with new possibilities. The quantum device blinked its green light, like it was agreeing. It had done its job that night a year ago, but its work continued through the people it had changed. Every time the teenagers shared their story, every time they helped someone else find a better path, they were passing on what they had learned. I've been thinking, Sun said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. Remember how we all got accepted to City College for next year? I've decided what I want to study. I want to become a teacher, like Mr. Johnson was. The others smiled, not surprised. They had all been thinking about their futures differently since that night. Du wanted to study engineering, hoping to work with Tommy someday. G was interested in counseling, and Ty had already started taking classes in community development. Mrs. Johnson went inside and came back with an old photo album. I want to show you something, she said, opening it carefully. Inside were photographs of all the people whose lives had been touched by this house and its owners. The Thompson boys at their college graduation. The Miller family at Christmas dinner. Dr. Maria Garcia in her white coat. Your pictures are in here too now, she said, turning to the newest pages. There they were, helping in the garden, working at the community center, studying with the children they tutored. A year's worth of changes captured in photographs. But the story isn't finished, Mr. Johnson said, pointing to the empty pages at the end of the album. There's always room for more. More people to help, more lives to touch, more roses to plant. The teenagers looked at each other, understanding what he meant. Their story wasn't just about how they had changed. It was about all the people they would help change in the future. It was about keeping the cycle going, passing on what they had learned about love and forgiveness, and the power of believing in people. As the afternoon sun started to set, casting long shadows in the garden, the teenagers got ready to leave. They had homework to do, and tomorrow they would be back at the community center, helping other young people find their way. Thank you, Ta said before they left, looking at Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Not just for forgiving us, but for teaching us how to forgive ourselves. The elderly couple smiled, standing together on their porch. Behind them, the quantum device blinked its steady green light, and all around them, the roses bloomed in white and yellow and red, each one telling a story of change, of growth, of love that was stronger than hate. The teenagers walked home in the gathering dusk, but they weren't the same people who had walked this street a year ago with spray paint and angry hearts. They were new people now, changed not just by the memories they had been shown, but by the choices they had made every day since then. They had learned that true change wasn't just about one magical night or one powerful lesson. It was about what you did with that lesson, how you lived it every day, how you passed it on to others. It was about turning yellow roses red, one heart at a time, until the garden of hope and healing grew large enough to change the whole world.